From the very beginning, this aircraft was considered simple and not distinguished by anything outstanding. It was not supersonic and did not have the latest weapons and systems. And oddly enough, it was this simplicity that became the main advantage, thanks to which it not only outlived its peers, but also managed to fly to this day. Hello aviators, Sky here, and today we are going to meet a horse that has been working for 70 years. Standing before us is the Douglas A-4 Skyhawk. The end of the 1940s, beginning of the 50s, was the time of a real aviation revolution. This was especially true of military aviation. After all, it was the dawn of the Cold War, and manufacturers driven by the arms race quickly switched from obsolete piston engines to the new fast and toothy jets. But among the advantages of fast and toothy jets came problems. These aircraft were much more complex and expensive than their predecessors. There is nothing special about this. Each subsequent generation is usually more expensive than the previous one, but this time the jump was multiple times higher. Along with a purely monetary problem came a problem with staff. New machines were much more difficult to pilot and maintain, which seriously increased the requirements for the number and qualifications of personnel. While previously, a machine could be patched up in a field by a team of brave guys, now any breakdown required almost a factory inspection. All this was superimposed on the obvious at that time truth: there must be a lot of planes. Nowadays, the Air Force is striving to have universal machines, of which they can purchase a couple of hundred and come down. At that time, 1,000 planes was the average. It was necessary to understand how to make the aircraft, on the one hand fast and toothy, on the other hand still accessible for mass service. These problems, oddly enough, were ignored at first. Many manufacturers thought the performance to be a priority, and the increase in cost was considered a natural process. If you wanted cool, pay up. But the team of designer Edward Heinemann, who worked at Douglas, considered this path to be not at all without alternatives. Yes, some combat aircraft should be top-end, but there is no point in expanding this practice to all aviation. In the early 1950s, Douglas proposed a compromise concept, which involved the creation of machines that may not have the most outstanding parameters, but at the same time are simple and cheap. A lengthy debate with the military followed, quite an interesting one, when the main topic was not how much the Pentagon was willing to pay, but what the Pentagon was willing to give up. In many cases, the military did not agree. They didn't want to give in to the mix for any cost savings. However, the US Navy became interested in the topic, because the Douglas project could solve the problem of carrier-based aircraft. The sailors actively developed the aircraft carrier fleet, building real giants. But at the same time, the fleet still had many old ships from the Second World War, which often simply could not work with high-speed, large and heavy aircraft. They liked the concept of a light and compact carrier-based attack aircraft, especially since the piston A-1 Skyrider was already clearly outdated. Outdated aircraft that were 5 years old. In addition, the budget for replacing the Skyrider assumed the cost of $1 million per unit, and Douglas promised to do everything for $860,000. The Navy signed the contract, and a little later the Marine Corps joined them. Thus was born the A-4 Skyhawk. So, what did they offer? They offered radical weight drop and simplification, when they had to keep everything that was absolutely necessary and throw out everything that was not.
Somebody tell me what this is. Plastic ice cream scoop? What'd that cost, about $400?
The A-4 has a low triangle wing of decent area but small span. So small that there was no need to fold it on the deck of an aircraft carrier, which means that there was no need to install a dynamic mechanism. It's not for nothing that I called it a triangle. It is a monolithic structure of a single load-bearing set, which was simply fastened to the fuselage from below. Again, there's just not a lot of assembly elements here. The high-lift devices are also simple. Large ailerons extended to the very tips. Large slats without drive motors, extended due to the oncoming flow. Split flaps. Unusual, but Douglas had already practiced this since World War II. They were complemented by a pair of speed brakes on the fuselage. These solutions influenced the landing gear. The wing was located very low, and so that something could be suspended under it, the legs were made very high but simple, thin and single-wheeled. Meanwhile, upon retraction, the main gear was covered with fairings. This made it possible not to make niches for legs in the wing. Only the wheels were hidden in it. The fuselage is also made as simple as possible. The nose of the attack aircraft was supposed to be armored, but instead of installing armor plates, the engineers simply made the hull thicker. Most of the volume behind the cockpit was occupied by the power plant, and they played around here too. The maintenance scheme involved disconnecting the tail, exposing the engine. Given the dimensions and weight, this was not so difficult. But this made it possible to abandon a large number of service hatches, which also meant mechanisms and reinforcement of the hull in these places. Clean, smooth metal. The air intakes are semicircular on the sides and slightly raised, so as not to interfere with the airflow of the wing and the gunpowder gases of the internal cannons. The tail has a cruciform design, a large fin and a pair of stabilizers, not all moving, with conventional elevators. A hook for landing on an aircraft carrier was placed at the bottom of the fuselage. There is only one fiery heart. Early versions of the aircraft were equipped with the Wright J65 engines, American version of the British Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire, quite a popular engine among early jet aircraft. Later, the aircraft received the Pratt & Whitney J52 engine, which was more efficient and reliable. Thrust 38 kilonewtons, with a slight further increase as upgrades progressed. The thrust was small, it did not have an afterburner, but this was enough for a light vehicle, and the Skyhawk wasn't trying to be supersonic. There were also exotics. In the mid-1980s, Singapore carried out a large-scale modernization of its Skyhawk fleet, and in addition to installing modern equipment, replaced the engine with a non-afterburning General Electric F404 with a thrust of 48.4 kilonewtons, engine from the FA-18. The remaining elements were also simplified to the maximum. There was no separate fuel tanks. Fuel was poured into sealed volumes inside the wing. Many onboard systems, communications, radar, navigation, air conditioning, ejection seat were redesigned or replaced with lightweight analogs. Everything was as compact as possible. However, later, when the plane needed to be equipped with additional systems, it turned out that there was no space in it, and the equipment had to be placed under the fairing behind the cockpit, which gave the later Skyhawks a distinctive hump. But without excesses. The aircraft was equipped with everything necessary for effective service. In addition, it was the Skyhawk that became the first implementation of the body store aerial refueling concept, when aircraft could refuel each other. This allowed them to take off with a maximum combat load and partially fill tanks, and refuel already in flight. Moreover, it eliminated their dependence on specialized tankers, which again may not have fit on old aircraft carriers. This practice continues to this day. The standard armament consisted of a pair of 20mm Colt Mark 12 cannons located near the center section, plus the base for an attack aircraft, various unguided missiles and aerial bombs, including the B-43. Atomic. After all, it was the Cold War. What kind of combat aircraft would be without an atomic bomb? Over time, the weapons were supplemented. There were new bombs, and among the missiles appeared the AIM-9 Sidewinder, air-to-air. The combat load of the aircraft reached 3.9 tons, which is very decent for a light aircraft. So, why all these dances with simplification? Skyhawk, while retaining good flight and combat capabilities, remained simple, cheap and lightweight. It was not demanding in maintenance, and its optimal design gave it a huge flight resource for that time. The length of the aircraft was 12.2 meters, wingspan 8.4 meters, height 4.6 meters. Empty weight is less than 4.5 tons, with a maximum takeoff weight of 11 tons. Compared to many of its peers, these figures seemed somewhat childish. Even the small Sabre was heavier in terms of the empty weight of the structure. The first contract with the US Navy was signed by Douglas in June 1952, and 2 years later, in June of 1954, the prototype made its first test flight. The testing program lasted for 2 years. Apparently, a lot of work had to be done to determine the balance of simplicity and efficiency. Nevertheless, the Skyhawk showed very good flight performance. The cruising speed was subsonic, about 510 knots, but it could accelerate to 585 knots. Once, during testing, the pilot accelerated the machine to 604 knots, 1,118 kilometers per hour. Funny, at some moment he ended up being almost the fastest in the world. In addition, the light and compact aircraft with good thrust-to-weight ratio and a large wing turned out to be surprisingly maneuverable. The range reached 1,000 miles, 1,800 kilometers. In later versions, after replacing the engines and optimization, the range increased even more, but only with a pair of external fuel tanks, which were practically a basic attribute. The maximum with external tanks and without weapons reached almost 2,200 miles, 4,000 kilometers. Deliveries to the US Navy and Marine Corps began in 1956. The military immediately fell in love with Skyhawks, and thanks to a large production scale, they quickly scattered throughout almost the entire fleet and bases, in and outside the United States. Soon, in addition to the official name, various nicknames began to stick to them, such as Tinker Toy Bomber, Scooter, Kiddie Car, and Heinemann's Hot Rod. Like other American aircraft of that time, the Skyhawks tested themselves in Vietnam, where they took on both the main role of attack aircraft and many auxiliary ones, such as reconnaissance. This work, in conditions of fierce opposition from the ground, was extremely dangerous. In total, 363 Skyhawks were lost during the war. Perhaps only in World War II there were harder fights. At the same time, the basic machines were actively modernized, gaining even greater capabilities. Among other things, to speed up pilots' mastery, the two-seat T-4 combat training version was created. The aircraft's maneuverability was appreciated by the Blue Angels aerobatic team, which flew them until the mid-1980s, when they switched to the F/A-18. Meanwhile, the Skyhawks successfully infuriated the cadets of the famous Top Gun school, acting as enemy fighters. In total, by 1979, 2,960 aircraft were delivered, and they served very actively. But the arms race was not over, and a decade later, the Skyhawks began to be replaced by new machines. The Navy began to retire the Skyhawks in the 1970s, replacing them with the A-7 Corsair II attack aircraft. The Marines began to get rid of their vehicles in the mid-1980s, replacing them with the AV-8 Harrier II VTOL aircraft. By the way, they were disposed of slowly, on a limited scale, and the aircraft served for training until the end of the 1990s. But the story of the Skyhawks did not end with the withdrawal from the fleets of the US Armed Forces at all. The plane was inferior to its larger brothers, but not radically inferior, and worked perfectly as an attack aircraft, and its price was extremely attractive. For example, instead of one Phantom II, you could buy 4 Skyhawks. Of course, it also found demand on the world market. The first to pay attention to this machine was Argentina, which began receiving aircraft in 1965, over the years increasing their number to 130 units. An important bonus of a light aircraft for the Argentines was the ability to operate on small aircraft carriers, and they managed to form a full-fledged carrier air wing on the deck of the ARA 25 de Mayo. The aircraft were actively used during the Falklands War against the British fleet. Despite the fact that the Skyhawks were inferior to the Sea Harriers, they still managed to cause a lot of trouble, damaging and sinking several of Her Majesty's ships. After the war, the modernization was carried out, and later the fleet was replenished with significantly updated A-4AR Fighting Hawks, supplied by Lockheed Martin. These aircraft are still in service, although the Argentines are planning to retire them in the near future, replacing them with the F-16s. The largest operator of Skyhawks was Israel, which had been eager to get this machine since the mid-1960s. Eventually, by the end of the decades, the machines flew there, and received their own name, Ayit. The aircraft, of which there were about 300, were quite actively used in military conflicts in the region and performed very well, becoming the basis of the country's attack aviation, and they served until 2015. In the mid-1970s, the aircraft went to Kuwait, 36 machines. They experienced their first battle in the early 1990s, when the country was attacked by Iraq. The invasion was so rapid that after striking the enemy, the Skyhawks found themselves in a situation where they had nowhere to return. The airfields were captured. So most of them flew to Saudi Arabia and continued the war as part of Operation Desert Storm. The aircraft also became popular in other countries. They were purchased at different times by Canada, Malaysia, Indonesia, New Zealand, and Singapore. The Australians also used the plane in their fleet of carrier-based aircraft on the HMAS Melbourne aircraft carrier. In most countries, the aircraft of course have already been withdrawn from service. But the Brazilians turned out to be stubborn. In the late 1990s, they purchased 23 aircraft, modernized them and renamed them AF-1 Falcons. And again they went to the Navy. First to the Minas Gerais aircraft carrier, and later to the São Paulo aircraft carrier. The long-term service is greatly helped by their own resources in maintaining and modernizing aircraft. This is done by Embraer. However, now that the São Paulo aircraft carrier has been decommissioned, there are only a few aircraft left, and they are used mainly for training. Their role has been taken over by the fresh JAS-39 Gripen. In general, it is curious that the plane, which first took off, I repeat, in 1954, reached the mid-2020s. Moreover, the production was closed in 1979, so many deliveries to different countries were no longer carried out from factories, but in fact from the secondary market. Not every machine can boast of this. The A-4 Skyhawk has served its purpose and has taken its rightful place among military aviation veterans, quite deservedly. This concludes the story for today. Like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the continuation. And if you want to watch the videos early, see some exclusive behind-the-scenes content, or just support the channel, consider joining our Patreon community. Clear skies, safe flights, and soft landings to you.